Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 192. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about history, religion, and architecture as we go to the Holy City, Jerusalem.
Got to see one more cathedral. Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have one news item for you. Musician Dave Carroll and his band were on a plane, a United plane we should mention, and they looked out the window to see baggage handlers throwing around guitars. Sure enough, when he landed, he found out his $3,400 Taylor guitar had been damaged. In fact, it was destroyed. And when he tried to get them to pay reparations, they refused. And so he wrote a song, United Breaks Guitars, which, along with the accompanying YouTube video, has gone viral. United has since apologized, and they've donated the cost of the guitar to Dave Carroll's favorite charity. For a link to the video, United Breaks Guitars, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Douglas Duckett. Douglas has been on before talking about Israel, and this time we're going to focus in on Jerusalem. Douglas, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Chris. It was a delight to talk with you before, and I'm looking forward to it.
And I have to say that was one of my favorite shows this year, and so when you suggested coming back on and talking about Jerusalem, I was excited about it. Israel and Jerusalem are someplace I have not been, but someplace that are definitely on my list, and even more so after we talked about it last time. Last time we talked a lot about modern Israel, not just historic Israel, so that was a treat for me, even though I am also interested in the historic country and the historic city. So Jerusalem. I can't imagine that this is a destination that we're going to be able to cover everything about in one episode of The Amateur Traveler.
Don't think we could.
So what should we focus on? If we go to Jerusalem, what's the minimum amount of time we should spend there?
Well, obviously it depends on how long someone has in Israel altogether. I generally recommend that you spend roughly, especially for a first trip, about half of whatever time you have in Israel and Jerusalem. I think an ideal trip to Israel is 2 weeks and spend a full week in Jerusalem, which often startles people, a full week in one city. But there's just no city in the world quite like Jerusalem. And you absolutely can spend a week there and not begin to exhaust things to do. You could spend 6 months in Jerusalem and still be finding new nooks and crannies, but you will certainly not be bored with a week.
And we talked about a number of things last time, like the Peace Kindergarten.
Peace Preschool or kindergarten, it's called both.
And we'll want people to go back and listen to that episode if they have not already. But what didn't we cover about Jerusalem? What should I see there?
Let me just sort of say why I think it's so central. If you're talking about history, and particularly the history of religion, it's remarkable that all three of, as I use the phrase, the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all teach that Jerusalem is the foundation stone of the world or the navel of the world. You'll have different terms used, some concept like that, and it's just remarkable how central it is to the faith if you put together those faiths of something like 3 to 4 billion people in the world. All three faiths believe that Mount Moriah or Mount Moriah, where the temple once stood and where the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim shrine, now stands, was the site of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. Although the Muslims believe that it was Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, who was bound for sacrifice. Christians once believed, at least, that Adam was buried at Golgotha, the site of the crucifixion, and that Jerusalem is, of course, the scene of Jesus' last week, his execution and his resurrection in Christian tradition. And for Muslims, Jerusalem's the setting for Muhammad's mystical night journey to heaven. And, of course, for Jews, Jerusalem has always been the heart and soul of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. It's the longed-for city. And so I can't imagine another place on earth that packs that much into tiny space. And when you're talking about the old city of Jerusalem, the walled old city, it's less than a square mile. And all of that is packed into that tiny space. I can't think of another place that has that much sort of punch, if you will, for a single city. And there's a lot more of that, too. It's not just all ancient history. It has a power that's drawn people, from, of course, pilgrims for millennia, and it still has an overwhelming impact on the people who visit it.
And my background is I'm a Christian, which I've talked about sometimes on the show. So let's not talk about that one first. Let's look at one of the other faiths and how they would see Jerusalem. What should I see when I'm going there to understand, for instance, Islam?
With Islam, the centerpiece is going to be what Jews and Christians call Temple Mount, but Muslims would call Al-Haram al-Sharif, which translates as the Noble Sanctuary in Arabic. And that is the surface of Temple Mount where the ancient Jewish temple had stood, but today has two of the most important centers of worship in Islam. There's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is at the southern end of Temple Mount, or the Haram. It is a stunningly gorgeous mosque. It dates to the 8th century. Across from it is, sometimes it's called a mosque, but it actually is not. It's a shrine, but it's generally called the Dome of the Rock, which is the magnificent golden dome that everyone knows from the pictures. Really, unfortunately, at this time, non-Muslims are still not permitted inside.
Well, that was going to be my first question.
Since 2000, and it's a purely political issue, it's not a religious issue, since the disturbances of 2000, non-Muslims have been barred.
Since the Intifada started?
Yes, the second one, yes. It's really a shame because it's a politically motivated restriction. It's a shame for a lot of reasons, but the inside of the Dome of the Rock is the most beautiful thing made by human hands that I've ever seen. It's just stunningly beautiful. I'm really hoping that that closure will lift. There are some groups that occasionally can get in of non-Muslims, and I actually have a guide that I've worked with in Jerusalem by the name of Sam Salem, who can occasionally, he works for the United Nations, and he can occasionally add some people to UN-sponsored tours. But that's very rare, and certainly no guarantees of that. Generally speaking, it's closed to non-Muslims. But that is the centerpiece for Muslim Jerusalem. There's also the Muslim Quarter in Jerusalem has other sites, but religiously that would be the center of the Muslim attraction of that city.
And I think of Jerusalem as the third most important Islamic city after Mecca and
Medina.
Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay.
It's important, but it's not as central as Mecca and Medina.
Okay. Anything else that I should see while I'm in such an important city that would give me a better view of the Islamic view of Jerusalem?
I know there is an Islamic museum on the Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount.
Oh, interesting.
There's also Islamic Museum of Art in the new city, and I have not personally been there. I've heard that it's wonderful.
And then moving on, let me put on my Jewish hat. If I want to see this city through Jewish eyes, where would I go?
Well, Jerusalem obviously is the center of Jewish life in the world and the center of Jewish history. It's hard to tell you where not to go to see things of Jewish importance in Jerusalem. But obviously, again, going to the same site, Temple Mount, which was the site of the two Jewish temples, the last one of which was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans, is the holiest place in the world to Jews. And then the place that people most think of is the Western Wall, or as it used to be known as the Wailing Wall, but really Jews have never really called it that, and it's a mildly offensive term.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
It's just not, it's really not a preferred term.
Okay.
Jews. The Jews have always known it as the Western Wall. And that is the portion of Herod's outer retaining wall of the Temple Mount complex that is closest to where the Holy of Holies, in terms of being accessible, is closest to where the Holy of Holies stood. And so that is the main focus of prayer for Jews, and of course all over the world people know that site of seeing Jews at prayer at the Western Wall. South of the current walled city is the city of David, which of course was the original Jerusalem. This was David's city. And excavations there in the last 10 years have really started uncovering remarkable things. And so that's something sometimes people miss, and I really recommend they tour the city of David. It goes into a current Palestinian village of Silwan, so I really recommend people not wander there unaccompanied, but there are lots of ways that you can tour it and see that site. In the Jewish quarter, which was the upper city in Second Temple times where the priestly class lived, at the time the Jewish quarter was rebuilt after the reunification of the city because the Jordanians had largely destroyed it. Lots of amazing archaeological sites were uncovered, including what's called Burnt House and Herodian quarters, which are two priestly homes that were destroyed in the Roman destruction of the city in the year 70. And particularly in Burnt House, you can actually see obvious evidence of the conflagration, including finding a skeleton clutching a spear. It's an extraordinary site that's been preserved. I mean, the city is, of course, full of Jewish history and Jewish life. The other piece that I always recommend to anyone of any faith or no faith who goes to Jerusalem is to go to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem, in the western part of the city. I just think it's part of the story that everyone should see, because the movement to rebuild a Jewish homeland was well underway long before World War II. But if there was anything that convinced most of the world that such a homeland was absolutely necessary, it was the Holocaust. And the new historical museum that just opened a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, is just extraordinarily well done. And so it's a very powerful thing. It's obviously emotional and it's going to leave visitors spent, but I really think any visit to Israel that does not include Yad Vashem is missing something important. So I would say those are probably the main sites that would be particularly of importance to Jews.
Okay. And then let's look at the city through a Christian lens.
In many ways, the cradle of Christianity. I'm also Christian. I will tell you the sites that probably most obviously important, but I'll tell you about them and then I'll give you my impression of them. The obvious one is the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, which is the traditional site, particularly for Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, the last 4 stations of the cross, and particularly the site of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. Now, many Protestants, particularly evangelical Protestants, tend to identify with a spot called the Garden Tomb that's outside the present walls of the Old City. They believe that was the site of Jesus' burial and resurrection. I mean, that's a much quieter place. But the whole Church of the Holy Sepulcher is shared by 6 different Christian denominations, most of them not even familiar to Western Christians. And I would say shared rather uneasily. I mean, there's sometimes fistfights between clergy, a lot of struggling over control. A Muslim family has for 700 years had the keys to the church because the churches can't agree on any Christians that would have the keys. Interesting little side story there.
And you say there are 6 different denominations there that I might not even recognize.
For instance, Ethiopian Coptic and Syriac.
Okay.
Syrian Orthodox, or Syriac sometimes it's called. The Roman Catholics are the relative newcomers. The Armenian Orthodox.
Right. I was going to say you're naming older churches.
Exactly. And it is interesting. I always recommend that anyone go to the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, but it is spiritually off-putting for most Western Christians. It's noisy, it's crowded, it's kind of smelly. It looks very unfamiliar. It's loaded. I mean, to folks from an Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's going to seem much more familiar. But to most Protestants and Roman Catholics, the iconography and so forth is just a little overwhelming. I've learned to appreciate it, but my first visit was a little off-putting. If people go to the Holy Sepulcher, for sure they need to see the Ethiopian Coptic quarters, which are on the roof of the church.
Okay.
It's the only quiet place in the church. It's actually the most moving to me, and the Ethiopian Copts, who were clearly the outsiders in the struggle for control, are always glad to welcome visitors. And then I would say, though, much more moving for most Christians are the sites on the Mount of Olives. And this was, of course, the place where Gethsemane is located. And there's so many places in Jesus' life story where we really don't know where things happened.
Sure.
But Gethsemane probably is Gethsemane. The name in Hebrew means place of the oil press, and there are olive trees there that are 2,000 and 3,000 years old, and it clearly was an olive grove back into antiquity. So this probably was where that happened. And there are a series of Christian churches down the side of the Mount of Olives that are really quite lovely. There's a small little chapel called Dominus Flevit, which stands for the Lord wept. It's a traditional place where Jesus wept over Jerusalem on Palm Sunday as he approached the city. It's a simple little chapel shaped like a teardrop. A little further down is a spectacular Russian Orthodox Church of Mary Magdalene with these gold onion domes. It's just breathtakingly gorgeous. It's hard to get into, only 2 hours on Tuesday. But it's worth trying to make work. And then you get down to Gethsemane, and a very modern church, but really spectacularly designed, called the Church of All Nations, or sometimes it's called the Basilica of Agony. It is a modern church that I think is very appropriate to the site. Most of my friends who I've taken with me who are Christian find that much more evocative than, for instance, a place like the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. But for many people, certainly for Roman Catholics, walking the Stations of the Cross on the Via Dolorosa is very, very moving and powerful to them. That can be a very special experience for Christians.
Okay. And you were talking about how we don't know where many of the places really were. As I recall, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher was positioned in that spot because of Constantine's mother, who picked that as the spot.
Yes, Helena. Helena went and sort of pointed and said, this is where this happened, and because she's the emperor's mother, up sprang the church.
It's good to be the empress.
There's some funny stories about that. Marcus Borg, a scholar who I have a great deal of affinity for, described touring with his wife, who's an Episcopal priest. She leads tours to Israel a great deal, and they were just outside Jerusalem trying to see the traditional house that, in the story of the road to Emmaus, in Jesus' post-resurrection appearance. It was closed, and the Israeli guy didn't miss a beat and said, not to worry, there are 3 others. And he didn't see anything ironic in that, and then there's a lot of places like that. You'll find the Greek Orthodox version of where it happened, and the Catholic version, and the Evangelical Christian version, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think a place is sanctified by people's prayers, so...
Well, and I know in the Middle Ages they used to say that there were enough splinters of the real cross to make a forest.
Exactly.
And what if I am not of any faith? Is Jerusalem just not the place to go, or what would I go see if I am not one of those 3 religions?
That's hard for me to say because, as a person of faith, I sort of can't separate that experience out. I think even if you were just interested in the history, you'd have to be a stone not to be moved by the power of the city. And just to experience this, and I mentioned this a little bit in our earlier interview, but it is an incredible mosaic of communities from all over the world, all these different belief traditions. You'll see everything from people who look like they stepped out of the 1600s to Israeli girls not wearing nearly enough clothes, looking incredibly trendy, on their way to a disco, and sometimes all of that mixed together in a way that really can be occasionally comical, endlessly fascinating. And I just, again, cannot think of another place in the world where you could park yourself for 2 hours at a place and watch that much diversity go by. So even if you're not religious, I think if you are interested in all these different traditions and peoples that sort of go up to make up our world, they come together in a remarkable way in Jerusalem.
And those are kind of the big sites, and mostly the well-known sites. What for you are the little sites that make Jerusalem today?
Let's think. Well, I have this wonderful tour guide I've used named Madeline Levine. She's originally from Leeds in the United Kingdom and now lives there. She's Israeli and has lived there for, I think, 20, 25 years. Madeline has this wonderful ability to show me things I've never seen before. And that's not easy. I've been to Jerusalem 9 times. And I always spent about a week there. So I've seen a lot of the city. But she always shows me little niches of things. There is a wonderful salvage archaeological dig on the slopes of Mount Scopus, which is one of the 2 mounts east of the city that overlook the old city, the other one being the Mount of Olives.
Mm-hmm.
This is where people are trying to sift through the rubble. The Muslim Trust, it was called the Waqf, without permission, excavated out another entrance to an underground mosque on Temple Mount and dumped out something like 12 truckloads of fill into the Valley of Kidron, which is an archaeological atrocity. This is material underneath where the temple stood. Did it without permission. And now you can actually go and be part of sifting through this, trying to find things. And you find things. I went and did this and found pieces of mosaic and pieces of bone, which is a little disturbing. But you really have a sense of hands-on history. There's a wonderful cave that she took me to that goes underneath a good part of the Muslim quarters, often called Hezikaih's cave, even though we don't know that it has anything to do with Hezikaih, but almost certainly was partly where Herod quarried stone to build the temple. And you can see these chisel marks from 2,000 years ago, and you know where that went, and it's just kind of chilling.
And this isn't related to Hezekiah's aqueduct, which was discovered relatively recently.
Which is Hezekiah's,
okay.
Yes. That's the tunnel, yes, that goes from the Gihon Spring into the city, and you actually can walk that, which is pretty amazing. A tunnel that we know about because construction was described in the Bible. Yeah, it was found a few decades ago, and you can now walk it. Now, if you do walk it, you need to have water shoes and be prepared to have water in one place up about to your waist. And you also need not to be claustrophobic because there's places where it gets pretty close.
And as I recall, this was undiscovered for, 2 millennia?
Yes.
And then rediscovered in our lifetime, complete with inscriptions about Hezekiah.
That's happening all the time in Jerusalem. When I first went to the city, there's a spot south of the Western Wall called Robinson's Arch, named after the American archaeologist who first identified what it was. And at that point, it was just a few feet above ground level, and it's clearly part of what was some type of arch. Well, now we know it was this massive staircase that led down to the street level, and when they excavated out all the way down to what was the first century street level, they found paving stones. This was the marketplace, by the way, where probably Jesus cleansed the temple, drove away people who were selling, because there were market stalls, and these paving stones were shattered because the Romans threw down pieces of the temple complex from up above down onto these stones. The stones are still there, and you can look at this and see the destruction of the city in the year 70. And when I first went to Israel, in 1988, they had no idea it was there because nobody had ever taken away the dirt from current level. And when they did, they find this. And that happens constantly in the country, this stumbling on places that and then allows you to sort of put together more of the historic puzzle of what did this city look like at that time, what was life like in this city at that time. Whenever anything gets built in Jerusalem, it's a nightmare to do development in Jerusalem. Because it is a modern city. It's the capital of the country. Yeah. It's the largest city. You sink a shovel in Jerusalem and you hit something. And then what happens is the project shuts down for 2 years while the Antiquities Authority comes in and excavates the site. It is extremely difficult and very frustrating to people trying to develop modern buildings in Israel because you just can't build anywhere without hitting something that's important.
Mm-hmm. What was the biggest surprise you had on your last trip there? You'd been there 8 times before.
That I continue to see new things, that I continue to find some part of the city. One of my discoveries on the last trip was the German colony in the southern part of a little south of the part of the new city that I stay in. And I use those terms, by the way. The old city refers to the walled city. Mm-hmm. The new city was the Jewish part of the city that was much more modern. And that 19-year period between 1948 and 1967, the old city and the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem were under Jordanian control and occupation. The new city was Israeli, and then after the war, the city was reunited. But in any event, there are several of these throughout Israel called German colonies, and they were settled in the 1800s by evangelical German Protestants who called themselves the Templars. Now, this is not to be confused with the Knights Templar of unfortunate Da Vinci Code fame. The Templars, with an ERS on the end, were an interesting Christian sect that believed in resettling the Holy Land. They did not believe in evangelizing Jews, interestingly, but did believe that by resettling the Holy Land, they could hasten the second coming of Jesus.
Huh.
And they built these fascinating buildings that are now among the most desirable neighborhoods to live in the cities where they still exist, and Jerusalem's one of them. This lovely neighborhood of boutiques and shops and restaurants in these remarkable, sort of stolid, very distinctive buildings. Once you know what these buildings look like, you can pick out a German colony even if you don't know that's what it is, because it's just so distinctive. That was a whole neighborhood that I had not experienced before that has this remarkable charm. And Jerusalem's like that. It's like an onion. You just keep peeling away the layers. You always find something new.
And how do we get around in Jerusalem?
Well, let me tell you first how not to get around in Jerusalem in my experience, and that is I really don't recommend driving around in the city using rental cars. And I say that's not my usual advice for Israel. I think touring the north, for instance, a rental car is almost essential, but driving in Jerusalem is truly a nightmare, and parking is even worse. It's gotten significantly worse recently because of major construction projects in the city. So what I always recommend is stay in a hotel that's relatively near the old city and walk, and bring good walking shoes, because you will walk and walk and walk in Jerusalem. And it's not always an easy place to walk in because a lot of the streets are cobblestone. When you need, just take a cab to places like Yad Vashem or the Israel Museum. And the cabs are easy to find. They're relatively inexpensive. Just make sure that you insist that the driver turn the meter on. They will sometimes not do that, and by law they're required to. So just stick to your guns and make sure they do it, and get out if they won't. The bus system's also very easy to use, and it's inexpensive. You can just ask your hotel, what bus line do I need, and they'll help you with that. People should not be afraid to ask drivers or even other passengers for help when they're trying to figure out where to get off and so forth. Israelis kind of love helping people and solving problems. It's sort of an ethic that everybody helps. In fact, one of the things that's funny about the Israeli character is if you ask people how to get to someplace, first they often will walk you there themselves, but they also may ask you why you want to go there and suggest that you really want to go see something else. And finally, Jerusalem's only about 45 minutes from Ben Gurion Airport, which is the international airport. So I usually recommend people start their trip in Tel Aviv, and their trip in Jerusalem, and there's absolutely no reason to go back to Tel Aviv for the last night because the airport's actually between the two cities. So It's very easy to get to the airport from Jerusalem, and it's only 15 minutes farther than it is from Tel Aviv.
Now, I'm curious. You say that sometimes you're going someplace and they tell you to go someplace else. What's the best suggestion you've had that way?
I don't know that I've ever followed the suggestions because I usually have a pretty good idea of where I want to go. I just get tickled by the fact that people get that invested in your trip. But I've had lots of times where I've started out someplace and I've met someone who ended up either inviting me to their home or taking me someplace else or just talking. And far more than a place to see, what I remember is that personal connection and listening to the stories.
Who stands out for you that you met there?
Well, this is not a Jerusalem story, okay? So we're going to go off topic a little bit. But my very first trip, I was trying to see the Baha'i shrine in Haifa and was walking with two really elderly ladies, literally in their 80s and almost 90, who ended up inviting me to their home because they thought I looked tired. I was 31 at the time. And, of course, being good Jewish grandmothers, come out and I get honey cake and coffee, and I spent 3 hours, and their lives were chapters from the history book of Israel. This was one of the major founding families of one of the major settlements in the Galilee. They grew up with Moshe Dayan. They had pictures with 5 of Israel's prime ministers when they were young men. And I never did get to the Baha'i Shrine that day. And talking to them was one of my greatest memories of any of my trips to Israel. So I always encourage people, be open. Don't get your checklist out and turn this into, I have to do everything on this list. Be open to the unexpected experience. Because Israel's full of stories like this. And Jerusalem particularly is full of stories like this. And just be open to meeting people and listening to their stories and let them invite you to their home. And don't be afraid of that, because that can be the most wonderful experience. And things are things, but the people make up a country.
Excellent. When we're in Jerusalem, are there any side trips we should take that we didn't already talk about when we were talking about Israel?
I can tell you some very easy side trips to do from Jerusalem. One is most people want to see the Dead Sea in Masada.
Sure.
That's easily done as a day trip from Jerusalem. People may want to go spend a night at the Dead Sea or so, but people should just know that that's a very easy side trip. And particularly in the summer, you really don't want to stay at the Dead Sea because it's just miserably hot. And Jerusalem, because it's much higher elevation, is much cooler, especially in the evening, so it's a more pleasant place to stay. Also for Christians, Bethlehem. It's only a few kilometers south of the city. It's literally a 10-minute drive. But one thing people need to know is because Bethlehem's under the control of the Palestinian Authority, you cannot take a Jewish cab or a Jewish driver to take you into Bethlehem. But you can easily catch an Arab cab from the old city. And there's an Arab tour guide who I mentioned earlier, Sam Salem, who actually is originally from Bethlehem. He lives and works in Jerusalem now, but he's somebody I recommend. He's a great guide, and he can take you into the city too. But you can do it without a guide.
And you say a Jewish cab versus an Arab cab. This is going to be obvious to me which is which?
Not necessarily, because many Jews, because they're of Middle Eastern origin, are really pretty indistinguishable, at least from looking from Arabs. These two peoples are cousins, after all.
Sure.
But if you go to the old city and the Arab portions of the old city, it's pretty easy. And so you can simply ask a cab, can you take me to Bethlehem? And Jewish drivers will say, well, I can take you to the checkpoint between where the Palestinian control starts. And Arab cabs will say, sure, I can take you.
Interesting.
Or the other thing you could possibly do is ask at your hotel and they can arrange it.
Okay. And we should ask, since we're talking about Jerusalem and we're talking about Israel, we didn't talk about it this time, any warnings you would give?
Only this, because, of course, people are very nervous about Israel travel generally and Jerusalem in particular. I would still maintain that walking around in Jerusalem, I am far safer than I am walking in my own city of Cincinnati. The crime rate is far lower, and the homicide rate is far lower. That said, you have to be aware of pickpockets and street crime that you could experience anywhere. And
Sure.
I think that's particularly true when you get into some of the really dense markets in the old city, where it's just very crowded and it's easy to kind of lose track of who's around you. So you have to use common sense. I don't think any more so than you would in any American or European city, but just use common sense. And I would say be aware, particularly on Temple Mount, which is probably the most contentious place in the world in terms of religious feelings and political feelings. Just be aware of sensitivities of the site. For instance, Christians and Jews cannot take Christian and Jewish religious articles up onto Temple Mount. Because it's under Muslim control, and Muslims forbid prayer, and if it is any prayer that is not Muslim. I think that's a pretty upsetting restriction, but it nonetheless is there. So you can't take your Bibles up, Christian or Jewish Bibles. If you're Jewish, you couldn't take your talit, the prayer shawl, because they're afraid you may pray up there. So some of those are practicalities that you need to be aware of. But honestly, I wander all over the city, even when I'm by myself, even the old city. I probably would not recommend wandering around a lot in the old city at night where you don't know where you are, or in areas that there isn't anybody else there. And it's not that I really hear of anything happening to people. I think you probably would just get unnerved. It would not feel real comfortable to me to do that.
Okay. Couple questions to wrap up. I usually ask, you really know you're in Jerusalem when what? But I'm going to ask it a little differently. You know you're in Jerusalem when you're eating what?
Oh, boy. The sort of national food that Israelis are known of so well, like Americans would be known for hamburgers, is falafel. And it's not unique to Jerusalem, but
Sure.
you probably get some of the best falafel in the world there. I'm going to turn your question a little bit and say, because I can't really think of distinctive Jerusalemite food. It's more senses. I would know Jerusalem more by smell and sound than taste. And what I mean by that is you go through the market, the open markets, with these spices and these scents, and it's just an incredible treat for the nose. But the sounds are what really make. I mean, I can hear a sound, and it puts me in Jerusalem in a second. And again, it's this cacophony, but it's a beautiful cacophony to me, of all these different sounds. The call of the Muezzin into prayer, the Muslim call to prayer, 5 times a day, with the ringing of the bells from the Church of the Holy Sepulcher or the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer or the other churches, with ultra-Orthodox men heading to the Western Wall to pray and maybe starting to chant their prayers, with the sounds of Arabic or Mizrahi, which is Middle Eastern Jewish music, playing over the radios, and all these different sounds together. And that's where you really feel this place has so many different streams of culture and belief. And that's why I keep coming back to the term, it's a mosaic. It's not a blend, it's a mosaic, because all these pieces are distinct, yet they go up to make the whole that is this city. And there just isn't another place, even in Israel, but certainly I don't think any place else in the world that brings all that together. So it is a place where your senses will get to you, but I would say taste is, I think there are wonderful restaurants in Jerusalem, and the guide that I know you're going to post on the site has a lot of references for that, but I think it's more those senses. And also sight, Chris, there is a character to the light in Jerusalem. I can't describe it, but it's part of it has to do with the Jerusalem stone that has to be used by city zoning rules to build all buildings in the city. It's this soft rose glow, like late in the afternoon with the late afternoon sun, and there's this quality of the light that almost everyone I know who's gone to the city comments on.
Interesting.
So I didn't get your taste there, but I think most of the other senses. And if you if you add in the feel when you touch the Western Wall, I've got touch in there too.
And if you had to summarize Jerusalem, 3 words, I think you've said mosaic.
I would use mosaic, and I think the other one is the name it's been known for millennia, which is Holy City.
Okay.
It's the Holy City. In Hebrew, Ha'ir HaKadosh, the Holy City. It's almost a second name for the city. In fact, the Arabic name, Al-Quds, literally translates as the Holy. And the city in Hebrew, which is Yerushalayim, actually translates as City of Peace. And we can only hope that we'll live to see that day, where it's a city of peace.
And to wrap it up, we should mention, Douglas mentioned a guide that would be posted on the site. Douglas has written a free guide to Israel and Jerusalem, which I offered to make available for free from the Amateur Traveler for download. So I'll link to that from this episode as well. It's also linked from the Israel episode. And it's a wonderful service that you're providing. I'd like to thank you for that free guide and all the work that you've put into it. You've been doing it for a number of years. We put a couple updates even just since you've last been on.
And I hope to return to Israel and Jerusalem in November. And if so, I will be updating it rather extensively after that trip, as I always do. And so I will, of course, send that to you. So you have whatever the latest version is. And I really appreciate you posting that, Chris, and helping me disseminate it.
No problem. And we didn't get into a lot of details, therefore, about places to stay and where to eat, because that can be found in Douglas's guide. Douglas, thank you so much for coming back on the show and talking about Jerusalem.
You're welcome, Chris, and I wish you and all of your listeners happy travels.
I do have one internet resource for you today, and that is a site called Tripit.com. I think we've talked about Tripit.com before, which allows you to control and keep track of your trip itineraries and send them out to other people and monitor various itineraries from your friends. One of the things that I like about Tripit, which is a relatively new feature, I think we may have talked about this site before, is you can take the email confirmation you get from most major airlines and just forward it directly to Tripit.com, and they will enter that in as your itinerary, which makes it much, much simpler than any similar site that I have seen. So that site again is Tripit.com. In news of the community, Adolfo left a comment on the episode on Venezuela and said, I just finished listening to the Venezuela episode and it brought back great memories. I lived 20 years in Venezuela from 72 to 92 and have combed the country several times. It was so sad what has happened to that country. My mom puts it best. The best country in the world to live in is Venezuela without Chavez. The second best is Venezuela with Chavez, which made me laugh. Keep up the great job, Chris. I really enjoy the podcast and hope to visit some really cool place sometime soon so I can be on the show. I have been to some awesome places, but it was either a long time ago, so the info will not be current, or they have already been talked about. On a side note, I am the twin brother with Jose, the guy you interviewed about Bhutan. And then in a first, I think, for the Amateur Traveler, we also heard from Jose. So this is our first twin brother feedback. And Jose also enjoyed the show in Venezuela, but thought that Diana didn't make enough a deal about the islands of Los Roques. They are the most beautiful beaches in the world, Jose says, and this is how paradise must look like. When I traveled to Australia, I wanted to visit some Pacific island, and once I got to look on the internet on some of those islands, believe me, Los Roques is even better. I'm surprised how many times recently I've gotten emails from people or comments about people who are listening to the Amateur Traveler on their nightly walks. This seems to be a very fit group, or at least a group that is trying to get very fit. But I'd have to say that I think Claire's email about how she plans to listen to the Amateur Traveler sounds good to me. Claire said, I just wanted to let you know how much I enjoy your podcast while I'm doing my daily walk. My husband and I are leaving for Europe in August to travel for a year by way of a camper van. I plan to bring my iPod and play your Europe podcasts on our folding travel speakers while sipping a glass of wine in the evenings. Every time I listened to one about somewhere wonderful in Europe, I knew I'd be listening again. And Claire, the other thing I would recommend would be a podcast which is no longer in production called A Year in Europe. I think that's also going to provide some useful information for you. And the last thing for news in the community, I did finally put up my video of my trip to Cozumel, so if you're interested in seeing that, if you subscribe to the video show, you already got that in your feed, and you'll get a chance to see both the resort I stayed at as well as some snorkeling and some of the other things that I did on the island, so I hope you enjoy that. With that, we'll bring this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. I'm looking forward to see some of you in Chicago next week, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that event, which is the meetup that we're holding next Friday. If you have any comments for me, feel free to email them to me as Jose did, or leave a comment on the show as Adolfo did, or catch me on Twitter at twitter.com/Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.